Okay, so it's 2 p.m. Looks like we're getting ready to start. We'll give a few more seconds here. We still have some folks that are joining. Okay. Okay, we can get started now. Hello, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Joel Bryan, and I'm the Global Post Sales Support Director here at Legrand for the Raritan and the Server Tech brands. And in today's session, we're going to be talking about the best practices for deploying and for configuring your environmental sensors. And walking us through the session, we're going to do a combined session today with both brands, with the Raritan brand and the Server Tech brand. We're going to start off with the Server Tech brand, and that's going to be led by Bruce Leclerc, and then that's going to be followed by the Raritan brand, led by Duncan Gwynn. Again, same feature across the brands, but sort of, how do you do it on each platform that you may have. And as usual, following the walkthrough, we're going to open up for questions as it relates to the environmental sensors and any kind of configuration questions that you may have, even around thresholds and so forth. And for anything else outside of the scope of that, as usual, we ask that you email either of our tech support groups at tech@raritan.com or support@servertech.com, or go to the website. You can also fill out your customer tickets online as well and get those submitted. And of course, you can always give us a call. We'll have a live person there to help you walk through any issues that you may be having. So with that said, I'm going to pass the ball over to Bruce, and Bruce is going to take us through the configuration on the Server Tech brand with the environmental sensors. And following Bruce, we're going to give a short, few minutes to have questions specific to the brand and to what you've just seen. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bruce. And Bruce, it's all on you right now. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. Yeah, this is Bruce, originally with the Server Technology brand. I'm going to introduce you to the standard sensors that are supported by Server Technology PRO1 and PRO2 PDUs. I'm then going to introduce you to an add-on device that creates support for additional sensors. I will proceed to demonstrate the auto discovery of the various sensors and the add-on. I'm going to trigger some alarms so that you can see what that looks like, at least in the web GUI. Then I'm going to show you where to configure the unit of measure, the sensor names, and how to adjust thresholds. I'll demonstrate a temperature alert, which is a way for you to validate that the temperatures and alerts are working. And then I will finally show you how to clear lost or no-com errors if a device that was auto-discovered is for some reason removed. So let's start by just looking where you'll find on the ServerTech website. It's servertech.com. Hover over products, go to accessories. That's where you're going to find some information on what we're going to look at today. Scroll down just a little bit, and environmental monitoring. I'm not going to open the data sheet, but you can take a look yourself if you'd like. So let me show you what sensors we have available. First off, all of the Server Technology PDUs, whether it be a networked or a parent PDU, which is what we see on the left, or a link or child PDU, which is what we see on the right, they both support two combination temperature and humidity sensors, which are the ports that you see up top. They're RJ handset port, 4-pin handset RJs. So we've got a temperature humidity 1, a temperature humidity 2, and then the same thing on the child PDU, a TH1 and a T/H2. So each of the PDUs support quantity 2 of the temperature humidity sensors, for which there has been 2 generations. We see on the left are generation 1 sensors and their part numbers. These have gone end of life, though I'm not certain that they're all out of stock yet. They have been replaced by a generation 2 sensor over on the right, and these are their part numbers available in 10-foot or 20-foot. There is a different casing, nicer for additional options for how to mount it at various points in the cabinet. Plus, it is more accurate on the temperature accuracy versus the older sensors. The relative humidity accuracy with the older sensors versus the new sensors has not changed. So directly, the PDUs support only combination temperature and humidity sensors. But we take a look up top here, we have what we call an environmental monitor control unit, or EMCU for short, and that is this device in the middle. This device adds support for a water sensor rope, which we can see at the bottom, and it adds support for quantity 4 contact closure monitoring points and an analog to digital channel. There's 2 part numbers, EMCU-1-1B and C. The C has replaced the B. The unit itself is the same and has not changed. The only difference is when you order one of those environmental monitor control units, it includes one 10-foot long temperature humidity probe, and the B model included the generation sensor. The C model now includes the generation 2 sensor. So the unit itself has not changed, it just includes the updated sensor. Let's take a closer look at that environmental monitor control unit. So it is made to reside either just directly off the networked or parent PDU, which case you connect it here. If there is a link in a child PDU, it resides between the two, like we saw on this page, and the child PDU connects to this port. So we've got 4 contact closure monitoring points that can be normally opened or normally closed, and a transition is what will create the alert. We have a 2-pin H2O or water sensor, and then we have an analog to digital channel. And we saw on this style of PDU that the temperature and humidity ports are here, but PRO2 PDUs have a different looking controller. On the left, we see a network or a parent controller for a PRO2 PDU, and we have a TH1 and a TH2 port. So they are labeled the same as the other style. And we see a link module for a link or child PDU on the right, and also a TH1 and a TH2 port. So it is as simple as clipping the temperature humidity sensor in the PDU, and that's what I will demonstrate now. I'm going to log into a PDU at administrator level. You can see in the upper right hand corner, I've logged in as an admin. I am now going to click on the sensors link, and as you can see at this point, the PDU has not discovered any sensors, has discovered none. So at this point, I am going to attach a temperature humidity sensor to the PDU. And upon refresh, we now find it has discovered both temperature and humidity. So it is really that simple. Just clip the cable in, wait a moment, and you have the readings. I will now attach one of those environmental monitor control units to the system. And since it just refreshed, I will refresh. And again, auto discovery of the device, it really is that simple. We now see that it can recognize a water sensor, 4 contact closures, and an analog to digital channel. Now I will attach a second temperature and humidity probe, in this case a Gen 2 sensor, to the environmental monitor control unit. And upon refresh, we now see that I have 2 temperature sensors and 2 humidity sensors. So A1, A is the parent PDU. 1 means that the sensor on it I've attached to the TH1 port. E is always the indicator for the environmental monitor control unit. We can see that over here in units. There is only at this point a networked or a parent PDU and the EMCU. The parent PDU supports up to 3 of the link PDUs. So if there were 3 of those attached, we would see a unit A, B, C, D, and then E would be the EMCU. Let's go back to sensors. At this point, we're going to take a look at where to configure the unit of measure and additional items, and that's going to be under configuration. You need to locate sensors, and here we are. This is the primary page for configuring whether or not you receive SNMP notifications or email notifications. You can change the names of the temperature sensors and the humidity sensors, water sensors, contact closures, and the analog digital channel. You can also change your scale, unit of measure, if you will, for the temperature. I'm going to just leave that at Fahrenheit. Down here at the bottom is where we find links for configuring the thresholds. We'll take a look at humidity thresholds. In this case, we find a low alarm threshold, a low warning, high warning, and high alarm. And we find also what is called a hysteresis, and that is if a threshold is exceeded, it needs to return to that threshold and that much beyond in order for the alert to clear. Okay, I'm going to go back to sensor configuration. Take a quick look at temperature sensors. It's the same 4 options. You've got a threshold for low alarm, low warning, high warning, and high alarm. And you also have a hysteresis. Okay. Now, as a way to test to see that you will receive alerts if for example, a temperature event occurs, one of the ways you can do that is just to simply change the threshold for a sensor that exists. Let's take a quick look at what the sensor is currently reading. We've got 73 degrees for the sensor attached to the environmental monitor control unit. I'm going to go to sensors. I'm going to go to the thresholds, and for that, I'm just going to simply set the threshold to be less than the current measured temperature. Now we can go back and take a look at overview, and we now see that a high warning exists for the temperature sensor attached to the environmental monitor control unit. So that's a way to validate that the sensor or the alerting is functioning. At this point, you could be receiving SNMP traps, emails, and the system also logs it in its own internal log, as well as it can send messages to up to 2 syslog servers. Okay, the final thing to demonstrate is how to clear an error that would exist or will exist if a device that was discovered is removed. So I am going to disconnect the environmental monitor control unit. And okay, upon a refresh, took a moment, we now see a lost indicator. And so unless you reattach the environmental monitor control unit, that lost indicator will persist. There was a temperature sensor attached to that monitor, so it's gone. So what do you have to do? In order to clear that, you either have to attach the device, reattach the device, or you have to go to the tools option in the left, go to restart, and do a simple restart, a standard restart, which if it is a switched PDU, as it is in this case, you will note that the outlets will not change state. A restart does not affect the status of the outlets. Okay, so I've performed a restart. We'll take a look in a moment. We'll see that it's no longer in a lost state, and I have not reattached that environmental monitor control unit. Now, while we wait, it's typically about 60 seconds. If any of you attended some of our previous webinars, I did one concerning configuration of thresholds and other items using the Server Technology INI configuration file format. So just keep in mind that if you have attached sensors, using the INI format is a simple and fairly quick method for configuring a good number of PDUs in a very simple manner. Another thing to mention, a different webinar, I discussed what we call smart load shedding. Smart load shedding is a feature built into the PDUs that allow you to automate control actions if the PDU is a switch type, and those control actions include items such as temperature events and humidity events and water sensor events. You can all automate on or off actions based upon pre-configured thresholds using the smart load shedding. So if you do have some of the sensors attached to the PDU, take a look at the smart load shedding section of the interface and you'll see additional items that can be of use for you. And the PDU is back up. We'll take a look and we no longer have any lost errors. The EMCU is no longer recognized because it's disconnected. The lost errors are gone and everything is normal with respect to the sensors that are still attached. And with that, I'll pass it back to Joel and take some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them or I'm going to unmute everybody. I just ask that you also make sure that your device is also unmuted, and then you can feel free to jump in and ask any questions. And we'll give a brief moment.
So there's one question in the queue, Joe. What is the underlying communication standard for sensors? Modbus over RS485?
No, this is proprietary. This is an I2C bus. Well, the actual sensor. It's a digital interface. That's none of those. It's a sensor on brand sensor. The only sensors that are supported by the Server Tech PDUs are the sensors that we sell.
Okay, great. I think I heard another question that might have been coming in.
What's the best location in the server rack to put these sensors? Top, bottom, back, front?
Right. Well, that's a good question, but very complicated to answer without knowing quite a few more details. There's a lot of factors involved, such as airflow with the equipment in that cabinet. You know, some Cisco routers flow, I think, right to left. A lot of devices are front to back. There's also variables with respect to whether you're doing hot aisle containment or cold aisle containment. There is an ASHRAE paper out that discusses those items. If you give me a moment, I can tell you what that is.
I think it's thermal guidelines for data processing environments. Is that the paper you're referring to?
Yes. Yeah. It discusses best practices for the number of sensors, which is 3 according to their recommendations, and then it gives a number of guidelines for positioning sensors based upon the environment. And yeah, it is ASHRAE. It's a white paper from 2011. Yeah, the thermal guidelines for data processing environments.
Okay,
I think it's a shareable item. So if you needed a copy, you can reach out to us and we can forward that to you.
Yeah, and if there's a link, I'm sure there's a link to the website. I think you could just post it inside the chat here so that everybody can sort of go see that as well.
I don't have the link. I have just the PDF, but we can find it.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Any other questions pertaining, or you could think and you can ask as we continue as well. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Duncan to take us through the Raritan brand of how to, again, best configure environmental sensors and take you through some of the steps that Bruce also took us through for the Raritan brand. Okay, Duncan, I'm gonna pass the ball to you now.
All right, thanks, Joel. So as Joel mentioned, I'm going to be covering a lot of the same things that Bruce just discussed, except for the Raritan brand. Some of the sensors that I will be discussing do apply to the new Server Technology PRO3X PDU, and I'll mention those when we get to that page. But I wanted to first start off with identifying Raritan sensors. You know, some of you have sensors deployed in the field already, and you may be trying to determine, what generation you have. So the DPX generation was our first sensor generation, and the connector for these sensor chains was an RJ12 connector. And the defining characteristic for these, I guess you could say, was that the sensor heads were kind of molded in place. They were not interchangeable. They were in a fixed chain. So, if you had one sensor go bad or, so on and so forth, you had to replace the entire chain. If you are trying to identify these remotely, you can also look at the serial numbers in the web UI. The serial number prefixes for a temperature sensor would have been AEH, and a temp humidity would be AEI. From the DPX generation, we went to the DPX2. So these also featured an RJ12 plug to connect to our PX2 and EMX, and these were different in the sense that the sensor heads themselves were removable. So they had a Molex type connector. You could actually, reposition the sensors, based on where you wanted them in the rack. If you wanted your temp humidity to, be at the top of the rack instead of the middle, you could move those around. Or if you had a sensor go bad, you could simply just replace one without swapping out the whole chain. So these had a serial number prefix of QMT and QMS for the temp humidity. The RJ12 connectors would plug into the RJ12 sensor ports on the PX2. And if you had an EMX, or environmental monitoring unit, they also had, depending on the model, anywhere from 1 to 8 RJ12 sensor ports. So from there, we developed sensors that utilize RJ45 connectivity. And I skipped to our DX2 third generation sensors. There was actually a DPX3, and it was kind of the same form factor, the same package, had RJ45 female connectors on both sides, but it was based off of the second generation sensor hardware. So the DX2 is actually our third generation. It uses RJ45. You can chain up to 12 of these together, 12 packages, if you will. You can't exceed more than 32 sensors. So one of the things about these sensors, the part numbers, if you have, for instance, a DX2 T1, that's just a temperature sensor. If you have a DX2 T1H1, that's actually a temp humidity sensor together in a single package. So kind of like the Server Tech sensors in that regard, where they're all temp humidity. That's what a DX2 T1H1 would be. Now we do have kits, so what would be pictured here is like a DX2 T3H1, where you actually have 2 temperature sensors, and then you have a single temp humidity. So there are different packages available, but the sensors themselves are all individual. They don't come with the RJ45 patch cables to go in between. You can get your own patch cables depending on how you're going to wire your rack up. You may require different lengths. So we didn't want to, put those in a package if they weren't going to be used depending on the installation. So these sensors have a serial number prefix of 1JX for the temp sensor and then 1EQ for the temp humidity. So if you see those in the web UI, you have the most recent generation of sensors, the DX2. And these DX2 sensors are supported on the PX3, the PRO3X, and the SRC. These all have RJ45 sensor ports. So this IX7 controller here would be what you would find in our PX3 PDUs and the Smart Rack controller, the SRC. You can see that we have the RJ45 sensor port here. As previously mentioned, you can chain up to 12 sensor packages. You cannot exceed 32 individual sensors. So you might have a sensor package that has more than one sensor in it, such as the T1H1 that contains 2 sensors in a single package. This over here is the NIM 8G controller that's in the new Server Technology PRO3X, and it is kind of based on the Raritan platform, so it supports the same sensors, and it also has an RJ45 sensor port. Jumping back to the PX2 real quick. So the PX2 will also support these DX2 sensors, the latest generation, but you will have to adapt that RJ12 sensor port to an RJ45, and we do sell an adapter to make that happen. And another important point would be that you need to be on firmware version 3.5.0 or later for the new sensors to register. So if you're running an old, 3.3.10 firmware on your PX2, you would need to upgrade that before the sensors will show up. So with that, I'll jump out of the PowerPoint here. On our website, if you go to Power, and I don't know why the drop-down's not showing for me, but if you go to Power and then Environment Sensors, you'll pull up a page where you can actually view our different sensor types. So much like Bruce mentioned, we do offer water ropes, contact closures, and various sensors. Today, we're just focusing on the temp humidity. Those are the most popular. But we have airflow sensors available, smart door locks, air pressure sensors, a variety of different sensors to choose from. So if you are curious about some of the other sensor offerings, you can check out this page and see what we have. And then another page I wanted to show you would be our help.raritan.com page. We actually have an entire section just dedicated to environmental sensors and actuators. And there's some good information about the different sensor generations here and the connectivity and some of the best practices there. So now I'm going to jump into the live demo. I have my demo PX3 here, so I'm going to go ahead and log in. And this PDU is pretty much at factory defaults, but the peripherals menu here on the left-hand side, if you go into that, this is where you would find any external sensors that you connect. So right now, I don't have anything connected. I wanted to show you the auto discovery process, kind of as Bruce showed with the Server Tech brand. And I will connect a DX2T1 to my sensor port on the PDU controller. And you can see that it automatically loads, gives itself a name of temperature 1 because it identifies as a temperature sensor. Now, I can chain more sensors to this. So now I'm going to plug in my DX2T1H1, which is a temp humidity. And you can see that after I plug that in, 2 additional sensors pop up. So it automatically names temperature 2, relative humidity 1. And you can also see at the very bottom here, we have an absolute humidity that's unmanaged. So this is by default, whenever you plug in a temp humidity sensor, there's going to be an absolute humidity sensor that's unmanaged because most people want to look at the relative humidity value. Now, if you wanted to monitor your absolute humidity value, you could check this box and you could manage that sensor and assign it, a slot, and it will automatically display with the rest with the reading. But we'll ignore that for the purposes of this demonstration, and I'll chain my last temperature sensor to this PDU. That pops up as temperature 3. They all have their readings here, and on the position, you can see that it, tells me what port I'm plugged into. On the case of a PDU with an IX7 controller, I only have 1 sensor port, so it's going to be port 1. But on some of our other products, like EMX 888 that has 8 sensor ports, that will obviously display the proper port that the sensors are plugged into. And then the chain position is going to be its position in the chain that I've just built. So the first one that I plugged in is going to be chain position 1, et cetera, et cetera. So we can click in the individual sensors. They've received a default name of their sensor type, and then of course an index value there. Now I can change this to something that's more meaningful if I'm going to be monitoring this and an external system of some kind. So maybe this is my cold aisle top temp sensor. I can save that, and then I could do the same for the remaining sensors. And that way, I know my positioning. As long as my installation is consistent, if I know that my chain position 1 is always going to be my top sensor, I can, name them fairly easily, or vice versa. If chain position 1 is going to be my bottom sensor, I could do the same thing across multiple cabinets. So for the individual sensors, we can also edit thresholds. So when you plug in a sensor, it's automatically going to use a set of default thresholds, which I'll show you how to edit in just a moment. But you also have the ability to use individual thresholds for each sensor. So if I'm going to monitor the top of the cabinet differently than I'm going to monitor the bottom, I could modify these here the deassertion hysteresis is just what Bruce described. So we covered this at length in another video, PowerTips Live, early on. So I won't jump into that too heavily here, but basically it's going to need to return to its threshold value and then exceed it by this value. Check this back to default. So you have individual thresholds for each sensor, but you also have default thresholds. So if I go back into my peripherals menu, if I click on this little 3-dot icon to the right, I have a default threshold set up. So in here, I can assign values for any temperature sensor that I plug in, whether it's my 7th or 8th sensor, it's going to use these default thresholds. So if I highlight the line, I can then click Edit Thresholds. And let's say I'll change this one down to 70, and I'll leave this one at 78. Now, if I go back to my peripherals menu, you can see that all of my sensors have crossed that upper warning threshold. So now they're all in a yellow warning state. And this will obviously display in the web UI, but it will also display on the controller of the PDU or Smart Rack controller to alert you that there's a warning of some kind, and you can actually view that warning on the PDU controller by paging through the menu to get the specific details. Go back into default threshold setup, and I'll just change that back for now. And you can see here that you can set up, these thresholds for, various sensor types, whether or not they're connected. So I could change airflow thresholds, relative humidity, for sensors that I don't even have connected. So another important thing that I wanted to cover is the actual units of the sensors. So that's a question that we get often is, by default, the sensors are in degrees Celsius, and people, in the US especially, want to change that to Fahrenheit because that's what a lot of their systems are using and measuring off of. So if we go into user management, we can look at user preferences. We can change our temperature units, length units, and pressure units here on a user basis. So I'm logged in as the admin user, so these would be my units for the admin user. So when I log in as admin, I'm going to see the temperature reading in this. Now, there's also default preferences. So these are for users that are authenticated via LDAP Radius that don't have a specific user profile on the PDU. They're going to receive these default preferences. And then also, if we send this sensor report to any sort of outside server, we do have a data push feature where you can just send the sensor logs to an HTTP server of some kind, and these are going to be the units that uses. So if I'm going to use that with data from another system, I might want that to be the same. So I could just leave that the way that I want it. I'll change this back, and that is per user. So again, the default for the PDU is degrees Celsius and meters for the unit of length, but you can modify those. So a couple other things to note. If you are a PowerIQ user, there are thresholds within PowerIQ that are not part of the PDU. So you might get an alert in PowerIQ that says, this temperature sensor is above a threshold, and really, it's just an alert coming from PowerIQ. It's not actually coming as a trap from the PDU. So they're mutually exclusive. They're different thresholds, even though they're triggering off of the same sensors. And then again, I just want to stress that for these new generation DX2 sensors, your firmware must be 3.5.0 or later, or they're not going to show up. We get a lot of support cases about that. They get a new DX2 sensor because the old sensors are now end of life. They plug it in and it's not showing up. And usually it's just a matter of upgrading the firmware, and it shows up and everything's functional. So at this point, I think that concludes the live demo. We can open it up for questions. I'll send it back over to Joel and he can take your questions. Joel?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Duncan. That was great. Both you, Bruce, did a great job. So like we said, any questions? I see Bruce posted sort of the standards on the data center thermal guidelines, so that's there for everybody to take a look at when they get a chance. Again, feel free to ask questions. You could type it, or just go ahead and speak. Just make sure that your device is unmuted.
Joel, there are a couple of questions in the queue.
Sure. Okay.
First one, can you configure relative humidity, absolute humidity for dew point display?
Gamal, you honestly might know the answer to that better than I do.
Yeah, so
But,
no, there is no dew point display threshold that can be configured at this time. But it could be considered for a future release. This is regarding the relative humidity, yeah. The next question is, do your sensors integrate with Command Center if we have that deployed?
So Command Center is primarily going to be for power control. So you're going to integrate your PDUs into Command Center to power down servers and KVM targets. It doesn't actually bring in sensor data. So that would be what you'd use a system like Power IQ for.
Okay. Yeah, some good questions. Okay. We'll wait a couple more, see if we get any more questions. I guess I need to figure out how to entertain while while we wait, so we don't have.
Joe, one thing that
end.
I did want to mention, you know, in regards to the placement question that we got during Bruce's time, you know, what we see a lot of customers doing is kind of following the ASHRAE guidelines for the cold aisle and doing a top, middle, bottom placement, and then for the hot aisle, they will measure. They'll place a single sensor and just kind of measure the differential between, you know, the cold aisle and the hot aisle. So that seems to be pretty common, but the ASHRAE guidelines, you know, is that document that Bruce shared will show you is they recommend 3 sensors per side. So they explain that a lot better in the document. So.
Okay, yeah, that's very important. Good information, Duncan. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see here. I don't know if we have any more questions coming in. We still got a lot of people on the line, but no additional questions as yet. Any questions typed in the window, Kamal?
So I think there was a hand raised earlier. George Russell had some question. If we can, unmute.
I have a question. So as far as monitoring these goes, then would we just use SNMP per PDU then, if we wanted to monitor these in something, you know, kind of more industry standard that is not a monthly subscription to you guys' DSIM solution? Like if I want to use Nagios for this, would I just monitor each PDU for each sensor?
Yeah, so you can pull the sensor data through SNMP. You know, depending on how you connect these up, you know, whether you're using like our smart rack controller, for instance, some people would use that to measure the temperature readings at multiple racks, or you know, they'll use the sensors on each PDU at the rack. So if you're plugging all the sensors into individual PDUs, yes, you would of course monitor, you know, do SNMP pulling to the individual PDUs for those individual sensor IDs. To get that data. But there's also, you know, as I mentioned, there's the ability to set up a data push if you wanted to, you know, export this sensor log data to, you know, one of your servers to kind of parse through that data. So you have the ability to send that as well. So there's multiple methods, but yeah, you could do Modbus, SNMP. A lot of different communication methods are supported.
Do you guys have any readily available documentation for MIBs, like a MIB library that's can be found easily? I've looked slightly and didn't find a whole lot, is why I asked.
Yeah, so if you go to raritan.com/support, our MIB is there, and also it is available on the PDU in the maintenance menu. So
Yeah, and if you need help finding that, you could send that question to tech@raritan.com, and somebody from our team will get back to you probably with the exact information that you're looking for.
Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
No problem. Duncan, did you touch on SRC much?
No, aside from mentioning sensor connectivity, I mean, it's got the iX7 controller in it, so it's very similar to the PX3 in terms of configuration deployment goes.
Okay. I'm just wondering if we should just talk a little bit about what the SRC is as it relates to the sensors. If it's up to you, your thought.
Yeah. So let me see if I can just go to our website real quick and pull it up so we can look at it.
Yeah.
Essentially, for those of you that are familiar with our old EMX environmental monitoring device, the SRC replaces that, and it gives you the ability to connect sensors. Supports smart door locks. This is our new SRC 0800 that has 8 sensor ports. So you can deploy this and use this for sensor management and all your intelligent needs. Essentially, it's got redundant power. It's got dual inlets, so it essentially has a failover on it. But yeah, it's the iX7 controller that's found in the PX3 PDU, just in its own little encapsulated rack controller. So everything that you can do with a PX3 iX7, you can do and more with this SRC 0800. More ports, more connectivity. You can do a lot with it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Duncan. Thanks for touching on that. Okay. So I don't. If we don't have any more questions, I want to thank everybody for joining. Again, if you do have questions, but maybe not ready to ask as yet, please email us at any of our tech email addresses, and somebody from our team will be in touch with you, try and help resolve some of those issues. So with that, I'd like to say thank you everybody for joining, and be on the lookout for another session in the future. All right, thank you. Good rest of your day.